Hello, Barbara. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well. Nice to see you, Marissa.
You too. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to have Barbara here today as part of our month-long webinar series around teen dating violence awareness and prevention month. So thank you for joining us, and we're so excited to learn more from you. First, I just want to thank the Diane and crew of Taylor Properties. I've known Diane for a while now, and she's been a great supporter of this important work, a wonderful communicator. She brings people together, and I know that her crew of Taylor Properties, they do great work as well as relationship based. And so we're just really thankful that they sponsored this webinar today, and we couldn't do it without them. So thank you very much. And Barbara, I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about you so everyone knows how incredible you are. The director of the University of Maryland Law School's Conflict Resolution Education Programs at the Center for Dispute Resolution, and a statewide leader in the restorative approaches. And in 2017 to 2018, you were the chair of the statewide Maryland Commission on the School to Prison Pipeline, which we are really excited to hear more about today. And as a trainer, a facilitator, and a consultant with the Maryland State Department of Education, assisting in statewide implementation of restorative approaches, we are just so thankful to have you here to teach us more about, this important and research-based change in Maryland. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course. So I think we'll jump right in. I've been really fascinated by what you do and how we've been lucky at the Aaron Levitas Foundation to get to work with you. You've been with us really from the start of our work. And I think for everybody listening today, it would be great if you could kind of jump in and help paint a picture in our minds of what does a restorative circle look like in a school. I know people are trying to understand that versus, how a situation could evolve, let's say, in the court system.
Well, it really goes to a whole different approach. And I'm a visual person, so I'm going to take a minute and share a screen that I think will help. When you think about, let's see, are you seeing slides now? Two different paradigms. You think about a punitive model in schools. A student does something wrong, the teacher, the administrator, who's ever the adult around has power, and they focus on what crime was committed. It caused some harm, and how severe does a discipline code provide guidance on what needs to happen? It's all about punishment. That restorative model, and we'll talk about circles in just a minute, is much more collective based. And that is, it involves those who have been a part of this issue of harm. So the focus, yes, it's what happened, but where was the harm? Who was harmed by it? What are the needs of that individual? And how do we get there? It's about a group. And here's where the circle piece comes in. Coming together and figuring out specifically who was harmed, what repair was needed, and also what support is needed for the individual who caused the harm. Because sometimes, we're talking about milder issues. Somebody said something, they bullied an individual, and that individual might be struggling as well. So that provides you some idea. When we talk about circles, restorative circles, that's exactly what's happening. A group is coming together, and an individual who's trained is facilitating that conversation, inviting the individual who was harmed to share his or her story, supporters of that individual, being there for them, but also telling their story as well. It's a lot of conversation rather than dictating, here's what's going to happen. The individual who created the harm, hearing from them about what they were thinking at the time and what they think they can do to try to fix it. And in many cases, their solutions can be stricter than what the system would dictate, especially in milder instances. So it's breaking away from that punitive model where I'm the adult, here's what's going to happen, you away, down to the office, you're going to be suspended, etc.
And what would happen, let's say, with like the punitive model to the child, like emotionally? Because we'll go into the restorative model and how that impacts the child, but what are some of the ramifications of that punitive model? What gets missed possibly?
That's a great question. What happens when it's that individual time and time again? Even students in kindergarten, third grade, is when they start getting sent down to the office or even suspended. The laws have changed, but you used to see a lot of suspensions for disrespect. And when you have a student who's angry or using language that you and I might find crude, the teacher might find crude, and that's the language that's being heard at home, they feel disassociated, disconnected. They stop being interested in learning. When they are reintegrated into the classroom, there's no reintegration. They come back in after a suspension period. They've missed work. They don't feel smart. They start losing interest. And that's the beginning of the slide in terms of what we often call school to prison pipeline.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That's, yeah, that's definitely fascinating. And you can see, how the restorative model makes so much sense, right? Like you need a chance, especially kids, working things out. And so you mentioned a little bit about the school to prison pipeline. I know we're going to talk more about that. Let's say I've never heard about it before. What should I know?
The school to prison pipeline is a phenomenon that's been around for about 20 years. And it really is used to categorize practices and policies that do push that student out of school. When the student is missing school, we can track it from third grade. Because of these harsh discipline policies, they become disengaged. They have a track record of suspensions and expulsions. In some schools, there's increased policing. There's a movement today to get rid of school resource officers, SROs, because very often they're called down to arrest this child. And that child might be in kindergarten. There are horrible videos of, particularly students of color being yanked down a stairs. Not to say that they didn't create harm. Maybe they got angry, tossed a desk, pushed a child, did something that was inappropriate. But teaching that child that all you get is punishment rather than learning how to behave better doesn't work. And this really refers to an over-reliance on law enforcement and the juvenile justice system to handle things. Just a little bit of history, because I really find history is fascinating. Where did this get started? We can track it to 20 years ago. Remember in the 1980s when we realized drugs had become a big problem in this country? So this zero tolerance drug policy started being enacted in policies in schools. And somehow it morphed into zero tolerance for just about everything, some of those mild issues. And so intolerance for a child who took a whack at another child, that happens, but do we want to arrest that child? That and Columbine on its heels in the 1990s really shook educators. We need to create safer schools. And so that crackdown on laws became enormous, and those stricter discipline policies came about. Exclusionary practice, exclusionary discipline, removing, that's what school to prison pipeline's all about. And we see the data, it's clear. School climate ratings go down. Students don't feel safer. There's a higher rate of future misbehavior by that child who has been excluded, whether it's an office referral or a suspension. We see higher rates of dropout, lower achievement in terms of individual academic performance, dropout rates through the roof. And that likelihood that that child is going to enter the juvenile justice system is enormous.
So thank you for that. I think that really brings it all together, right? Why restorative approaches can be the right approach. And I want to talk a little bit more about, what does that look like in Maryland? What's happening right now with the state of Maryland and restorative approaches?
Maryland is really, in some ways, a leader nationally, catching up to others who have been doing this for a while. A leader because we're unique in some ways. We have 24 school districts, so we can really think about how to do this work statewide. The Maryland Commission on the School to Prison Pipeline and Restorative Practices that you mentioned in your intro was also quite unique. It came out of the impetus of one gentleman who is a delegate in Prince George's County. And he, in his own school experience, encountered school to prison pipeline. He saw his brothers, his best friends get locked up, and he wanted to change things. So he tried to, and he was advised, try to get a commission passed. And so this commission spent 18 months and then another 6 months advocating in Annapolis that we needed to change what we're doing here in Maryland. So we passed laws, and House Bill 725 codifies this work and says Maryland schools must use restorative approaches. Restorative approaches is a rather unique term. You hear the term restorative practices, restorative justice. Maryland's unique in this as well. We decided as a commission that we really wanted to think more broadly. We wanted to incorporate social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, mediation, some other tools and approaches that are not what's traditionally thought of as restorative conferences. So we have created something broader, and we are now, the bill was passed a couple of years ago. We are working statewide. MSDE, the Maryland State Department of Education, hired me as a consultant because they saw they really needed some help in launching this and supporting the 24 different local school systems. So that's exactly what we're doing this year.
So you mentioned, okay, so that's incredible that Maryland's doing that, and exciting, I think in Maryland is a leader. Tell us about, I know you've done work in Baltimore City. So why the focus in Baltimore City?
Baltimore City has stepped up in a big way. We have some local school systems that are just getting on board now, but they've recognized a couple of years ago that we need this. There's a great deal of trauma, there's a lot of need, and the school system, like many, recognize a lot of room for improvement. So they've been working on this for a while, and they actually are now implementing in, I would say, at least 75 schools with support. Support is more than just getting people trained one and done. It's about coaching, because we're talking about teaching educators, school leaders, school psychologists, new tools for handling problems. And to be clear, restorative approaches is not just reactionary, but it's really about positive. It's about proactive. How do we build communities so that there's not the kind of bullying or harm to one another?
Hey, Ed.
Sorry, I think sorry about that. So no, that makes a lot of sense. And sorry, I've got a little distracted there.
Or just a little more about Baltimore City
please,
while
please,
you
keep going.
collect your thoughts. We have had a couple of schools doing this work in Baltimore City for over 10 years. City Springs Elementary School, for example, doing amazing work. And that's exactly why that's become our launch school for the Levitas Initiative. All the teachers are trained, a very tough area, but all the teachers recognize we need to build relationships. We need to create safe spaces in the classroom. And that's really what this looks like.
What are some of, can you share either like some of the science or research behind what else is developed when using restorative approaches with children, or the science behind using restorative approaches versus, the other punitive options?
Well, as I mentioned, a lot of this is skill building. There are some students, whether they're traditional educated students or students with special needs, who may lack skills, social skills. It might be difficult. This is universally available across the board for all students. And using restorative approaches as a teacher, the emphasis at the high school level, and this is a big change for lots of teachers, is you need to build relationships to optimize learning. Think about your own experience when you were in school. What subjects did you love the most? Were those the teachers you felt most connected to? And the answer may be yes. So what we're doing is really helping students at all levels optimize their learning. So when we talk about restorative approaches, we're not just talking about discipline. We're not just talking about harm. We're talking about a set of approaches to optimize learning for every student. working in special needs classes where there is more data around exclusionary practices, much higher suspension rates, certainly in terms of disproportionate data. In Maryland and nationally, we have students of color being suspended at somewhere between 3 and 5 times the rate in some communities. So what we're doing is building connections between educators who might look like me with students who come from different backgrounds, speak different languages. Bridging that gap helps us optimize learning.
And what does this look like in a private school setting?
You know, private schools are getting on board. I can't speak specifically to Maryland schools, but this has been around now for a while. And there's a recognition that although private schools may or may not have more money at home, children still are challenged. It's tough growing up. You know, we might see a lot more things like eating disorders, drug abuse in some of the private schools. We need connections. We need to bring them out. In some cases, if they're not connecting at home, we want them to connect with other adults. I have done some teaching at New Century School in Baltimore City, a private school. I happened to meet a principal a couple of years ago, and she was fascinated and said, "Can you come train all my staff?" And that was really exciting. In Baltimore City, it doesn't look like the private schools in some of the suburbs in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds. The issues are the same and the needs for individuals are the same.
I think that's so important for everyone to kind of hear and know, you're right. It's being in a different place does not change. It might change the conversation a little bit or the scenarios that the students are coming up with. But they're children going through, growth, and they have different things happening at home, but still looking at the same social media and same life situations, maybe in different fashions. But that's helpful to know that this works everywhere. I'm curious, you mentioned the example of like a child throwing a desk. And I think, we've all seen, we all grew up and we saw all different types of actions. What are some of those actions, I think, that would be a reason to circle up or to use the restorative approach? And then if you want to add into that, what are some of the things that gets children kicked out of school if this method is not used?
Well, I'll break it into 2 different types of circles. What type of circle would gather people together? Usually when schools implement this work, they start with community building circles because there's a recognition. And by the way, this work really starts with the adults. I was conducting a training with circles involving leaders in a state leadership meeting yesterday. Had the adults in circles, in breakout rooms, in Zoom, teaching them how to connect, how to talk about a particular topic that we were discussing. Connections and exchanges, that's what we're trying to build. So in the classroom, we're trying to build the same. We're trying to build relationships. A few years ago, the buzzword was bullying prevention. We've moved on, but that still exists. Kids can be mean to one another, and it can create severe consequences, as severe as suicide. So we need to do something different. If we can build connections between different students, those community building circles create a wonderful tool. Problems can be solved in broader circles, whether it's a classroom circle or a component of a group of students. It can be substitute teachers. And what happens the day after I'm the teacher, I come back and I hear my students were terrible. Okay, I can scold them, I can punish them, no recess today. That doesn't really teach them. So we have a conversation. We talk about behaviors. We talk about the impact it has on others. And then we talk about what they can do to try to repair it and what they can do next time. So it's fashioned in more of a circle process, but in terms of they're coming up with solutions. And with open-ended questions, I'm inviting that thinking. And it's really become a rich conversation. In terms of more severe instances, we see everything across the board, whether it's fights, whether it's drugs. There's more and more latitude. But, when we think about harm and the topic of this month's discussion, you might have a student who pats somebody on the butt, playfully. Boys in late elementary school, middle school, that's a big deal. Sneak up and, or patter somewhere else that's not acceptable. Yeah, we can punish that child. We have codes that do that, or we can create a small circle, inviting family in to be a part of that, inviting maybe a trusted educator who can help support that student in changing behavior. It happens if the student who's been harmed wants to be a part of it. Nobody drags anybody in, and that person would be invited to bring supporters, family members, or friends. And we talk about it in the same fashion. The what happened. Maybe that student who was just patting a girl on the butt thought it was funny, and to hear how upset it made this girl feel. Hearing about the supporter's perspective, broadens it. A recognition that this is a problem. How do we change this? Hearing from the adults and how it impacts them, and then collaboratively defining agreements. Another example might be a young student exposing himself. This happened in a school. It probably happens more often than not. Oh, yeah, we could go punitive. That's not acceptable behavior. But again, with restorative approaches, we're focused on teaching students better before it gets to be really severe harm. And this is where we need to do it in schools, in that elementary, middle, and even high school place where we still have them and they're not out of school and on the street, because then all we have is our justice system. And when you look at our prison systems today, it's not really the turnaround, and the changes is not really necessarily helping individuals.
I think that's so eye-opening. I have two young boys, and my son is 3 years old, and I can just and I can see the examples that you give, when you just kind of shut things down sometimes, right? Like, do they learn? But when he comes up with his own solutions, it actually helps him hold himself to it, because it's that much stronger. And I got to do a circle with you, and bringing in all those people, it's very serious, but it's also that you have that support. And I could see how that change could really be made, right? You don't forget that experience of seeing other people's reactions and how they felt. That, you can really see how that makes incredible change versus just anger, that might come up from, not getting a chance.
Yeah, and the other thing I do want to point out is this work largely evolved out of supporting the individual who'd been harmed. Traditionally, the term victim was used long ago. We don't use that term today. We talk about survivors. But in terms of giving that individual an opportunity for voice, the hurt, the impact there, never having a chance to say one's piece. Our prison systems don't do that well. I think about an instance, a friend of mine had her daughter, a grown daughter, be killed in a hit and run accident. And all she had a chance to do in court, they found the guy, was talk for 2 or 3 minutes about her daughter and hold up a photo album. She wanted to sit down and have a conversation and find out what this individual was thinking and let him know the impact that it had. That's the kind of restorative conversation. It doesn't change history, but it helps. It helps everybody mend and heal.
Yeah, I mean, you see this, if these kids could learn these skills early too, right? What does it look like when they are in high school or in college or after, or wherever they follow, after elementary school, and to see how they solve problems, and not going to the blame, or working it out and trying to be better. So that's really incredible. I'm curious what you would say to someone who says, well, these things, won't happen to my child, whether it's the school to prison pipeline or, we'll start with there, I guess.
Yeah, you can say, oh, my child's never going to do anything that horrible. But let's look at our communities today. We're all affected. And when you think about the numbers of individuals who get caught in the prison systems for years, if they get out, or the fact that they're not there, and you have families that are not financially supported, maybe the father is locked up for 20 years, because of drugs. I mean, we know that that happened in ways that perhaps white people would not have been locked up with better attorneys. We have that happen. So now we have this impact on communities, and it affects all of us. We look at Baltimore City having a difficult time getting out from under the violence. And I really hold our history of this school to prison pipeline as part of the reason why. Lots of these individuals, their family members, young people today grew up without parents, without funds to support them. And it impacts us all.
Right. And having these kids learn all of this just creates, a better next generation, right? So whether you're a part of something and you see something happening, if it's very easy to get caught up in all of this. Like I know, it'll even go to things like sexting, right? And that's very available to everybody. And so it's not just, things that one might think of as very violent, right? There's just so much that this can impact, and how, and that can relate to prison depending on how far you take it.
Yeah, and the other thing to realize is that the harm to one another, unfortunately, it's universal. It doesn't have to do with, communities that are struggling financially. We have crimes happening. We have white collar crimes. We have sexual assault happening in all of our communities. It's the unspoken crime. And what we need to do is teach students very early on to have empathy for one another. And sometimes entitlement doesn't allow that. And so, getting to know one another in community building circles, hearing how when something happens and somebody's harmed, how they feel around issues like boundaries, and, he keeps putting his arm around me sort of thing, might help somebody understand a concept like boundaries, preventing later harm.
Right. And speaking on prevention, like getting into that, I know, like I said, you've been part of the Levitas initiative from the start. And how do you see all of this intersecting with the possibility of sexual assault prevention?
Oh, I mean, it's really thrilling to be part of this. This is a deep, deep problem that runs through our society. It's sort of the unspoken issue, and Levitas has done such a wonderful job of elevating it. I think that we need to broadly be thinking in these terms. I think it's wonderful that we're doing this work in schools. Eventually, we have a criminal justice system, and there are restorative justice practitioners working in our communities. We need to be taking these tools and using this with all of those who are harming others, because it's in our best interest to not lock them away, because it harms their communities further, it harms their families further. And in some cases, when it's done in disproportionate ways, which unfortunately is our history in this country, students of color, students of Hispanic backgrounds in some communities, it breeds harm in those communities. We really need to think about how we can change the way we're reacting and support those, give them the support when they're hurting others to do better next time.
I think I love what you said there, because I have a lot of conversations with people, and they say, how could somebody do something like this, right? Like cause, harm and sexual violence. And I know that a lot of the research shows that, what happened when you were a child, it can impact that, right? What you see, I choose to, give my children hugs and kisses, but if I did other things, then why would they think that the person who loves them the most, why would they think that that's wrong, or it's something they see? So that just makes so much sense about how, we have to think about that person too, because that's where a lot of the change can happen, right? If we can impact that critical time when the children are learning, making mistakes, things that maybe are not the right way to continue. But if we can stop that, we can stop, like you said, that later harm.
Yeah, I mean, counselors have said to me before, hurt people hurt people. And so when you think about that student who is repeatedly suspended or even expelled, or who is being assaulted at home, they're a more likely candidate for hurting somebody else if they can survive what's going on in their worlds. And, you know, in some communities, young people don't expect to live past their 20s. It's really a sad thing. The other thing that occurred to me as you said that, Marissa, is I've become so much more cognizant of my power as an individual, but even as a grandmother, when I get to visit my grandkids. And as we're leaving, my son might say, you know, give her a hug. And if that child right then and there doesn't want to, I went, no, don't make them. I love you, and leave it at that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm respecting that 3-year-old, almost 5-year-old's boundaries, because I'm starting to recognize that that is so important to their individuality.
Yes, I learned that too, because my son didn't really like that at first. And we did the fist pump, we offered him other solutions, but I had learned that as he grows up, if he was made to hug somebody, anybody, they're kids, right? So when they grow up and somebody else, let's say of a higher power in a way, said that they must hug them, we are not teaching our children that they're allowed to have those boundaries, because it's confusing. You have to do this with this person, but not that person. And many times it is people, we know that, over 70% of, sexual assaults are by people that, and so it's really important to help them understand those boundaries so they can create those lines as they grow up and evolve.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious if someone, who doesn't use restorative approaches in their school, what can they do to get informed in this incredible, method?
Well, in Maryland, they should be informed because it's coming through the local school systems. Nationally, there are organizations, there are trainings, they can just go online. I have done training through the International Institute of Restorative Practices, and they're broadly known throughout the country and internationally. There are different states that have fantastic websites with information. So the information is there, and I encourage people to explore it and realize that this is not strictly for discipline in the classroom. This is really for teaching skills, for addressing trauma, for addressing students at all levels, and thinking about strengthening communities, because we know in education that when a student is connected with at least one adult in the schoolhouse, the likelihood of their slipping down into that school to prison pipeline is reduced.
That's incredible. I know that we did a training, and the teachers, they can do so much. There's so much there with that relationship. So it's incredible that this can strengthen that connection. And it is Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, and I'm curious, how do you see this work with the restorative approaches and sexual assault prevention, making a shift in real change to our future?
I want to go back for just a minute and just add one other thing before I answer that, if I may. We talk about relationships with teachers, but in the schoolhouse, there are lots of other adults. It may be a relationship with the bus driver. It may be the librarian, the nurse, the school monitor. It might be the school resource officer. All of those individuals have the potential for change. Give me that question again, please.
Okay, yes. So it is, it's, and thank you for saying that, because a lot of actually our education, I know, is with, whether it's the health educator or, everyone in that school has a chance to uplift, a child's, the connection with the child. So that's a great point. Noticing that it is Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, I'm curious to help us see your perspective on how restorative approaches and sexual assault prevention, how will they together make a shift towards change, right? So we see less teen dating violence in the future.
I really do believe that doing this work of restorative approaches, restorative practices, connections in schools helps us build empathy toward one another. And it also helps the reluctant talker, the introvert, learn to speak up for his or herself. We have a lot of issues around students who are finding their identities are not what they look like. How do they find voice for that and not be victims of harm, which they often are? And so providing opportunities in circle, in conversations, the gay bashing sort of thing. The suicide rates are enormous. When you look at organizations like GLSEN, GLSEN, you become aware of what they endure every day, the microaggressions, et cetera. So that's an example of how do we help them survive school? And this is how. Proactive circles, and when the teacher notices horrifying terms under students' breaths in the locker room, in high schools, on teams, not choosing a certain individual because of the way they look, whether it's their color or their language, those are the sorts of things that can help plant seeds for self-harm and harm of others. Anger, very often that emotion of anger is really the top of what's underneath. Often it's hurt. So what we need to do is provide opportunities for students to talk about what's going on and find help. And what's key to restorative practices, restorative justice, and restorative approaches is about relationship. And it's about educators focusing on strengthening relationships. So students who have the capability, the potential future of being harmed severely or harming others, before it grows, before patterns, before they're locked away, we find out more. And it's interesting because lots of teachers really think I need to have a boundary around my personal self. I'm not going to share. And that is their prerogative. But I will never forget, I was doing a training in restorative practices in a very urban school in Philadelphia. And one educator shared with me how she had grown up with parents who had drug abuse problems. And at some point, she saw some of her girls struggling and she kind of knew what was going on. And she shared about her own story. I'm not saying that teachers have to do this, but when she did, all of a sudden things changed for those girls. They opened up to her. There was a care, there was a bond that was built, and it probably changed their experience in school because now here was an adult who understood what it was like for these two girls who had drug issues in their home communities. The potentials can be all over in those little small places.
Right. I think you mentioned, what they're having in their own school homes. And I was thinking about the question we talked about before, how depending on where you are, right? Like what makes your home an unsafe environment. And it doesn't have to be something, it can be abuse. It doesn't have to be something like abuse. It could be even having a family member that has unhealthy gender norms, right? So it really can span what the children take into the school. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And, this leads into a question that we have that's great is, you talked about sharing a little bit about yourself, right? As an educator, someone working with kids, and we're all people, right? Like when someone is not giving you something, it is hard to trust and create that relationship. And I know when the law students go into the schools and the social work students to work with the kids to offer this curriculum and, using restorative approaches. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's involved with the law students' experience in delivering this information and using the restorative approaches?
Absolutely. When we developed the curriculum for our law students to utilize in working in schools, we were very conscious about how to use circles to build community. And the way a circle works is it's not me asking a question of everybody in a circle, but in fact, it's putting out an open-ended question. It might be something starting lightweight. My favorite guilty pleasure might be hot chocolate chip cookies. And I would share that. And then I would invite others in the circle to share, having an option to pass, because everybody gets a chance to pass. We respect boundaries, verbal boundaries. I'm not ready to share. It doesn't feel safe. Kids might bully me or pick on me. But the students also open up as well. a time when communication, for example, that was one of the focus concepts in the curriculum. What's difficult about communicating? And being honest sometimes and sharing something, here's what happens for me. We're careful about where those boundaries go as educators, as our law students serving as an educator by facilitating the circle. They understand what they might share, but they also get to be real and share nuggets of themselves. You know, I remember one student sharing about his little boy, and here's what he saw. And they were interested. Often after our circles, they would ask us a little more, what's it like, da, 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 because they want to get to know us as individual, and we get to decide where we put those boundaries down. But that's what starts building trust. You're asking me to share something deep, but you're not sharing anything. That doesn't really work.
Mm-hmm. And where's the importance, do you think, from the law student or social work student perspective, you know, how does it benefit them to get to deliver this?
They love it. You know, I love University of Maryland School of Law's clinic program generally, because it really is rich in learning outside of learning code, learning laws. It's learning life skills. And, you know, we always debrief. We always have faculty there to support when questions arise, when they're self-doubting, but they're just learning and building up a set of skills that they're going to take with them into whatever they do next, whether it's working for a big law firm or going into a nonprofit. And I think that the students that opt to work with us in the Levitas clinic, in the clinic associated with the Levitas work, they're self-selecting because they recognize that the issues of sexual assault are so important to them personally, and they want to bring about change. So it's doubly empowering.
Mm-hmm. That's great. We have another question. Before we do that, I wanted to ask you, you know, for everybody listening today, you know, as a community member, you have grandparents, like you said, parents, friends, what are some ideas kind of from restorative practices that one could take away, you know, use in your own real world?
That's a great question. You know, you've heard again and again, this work is really grounded in building relationships. And that opening slide really showed the difference between strictly power-based versus more collaborative. So I would say that's really important. You know, besides my work in conflict resolution, I do life coaching, and lots of people struggle with community, with connection. It doesn't feel comfortable sharing certain things. I think that if we think about a conflict, and we have, all of us have conflicts every day, and we think about, how do I resolve it? Instead of necessarily, here's what we're going to do, whether it's conversation with a friend, here's what you should do. How often do we do that? We tell our friends what we should do, or we tell our children what we should do. Some of us who have their parents might even tell our parents what they should do. It doesn't usually go very well. But instead, if we ask them some questions, so it sounds like you're really bothered by XYZ. Tell me a little bit about that, and just reflect. So it sounds like XYZ. So what are some ideas? Would you like to hear, respecting boundaries, what I might do? Nope, not interested. Okay. Okay, so here's one suggestion. That's another way to do it. Mm-hmm. The other takeaway as we've talked about, is honoring space and people's choices to do that. You know, my husband has a friend. When we get together in groups, he's all huggier than I'm comfortable with. And I have learned to say, hey, cool it already. Whereas once upon a time, I mean, big groups of us there, my husband's right there, but I have learned to say that. So we get to put down our boundaries and honor ourselves. So there are certain things that we can take away, and realize that addressing harm can be done in a way that respects the individual, but not what they've done. So if somebody has said something, we hear it through the grapevine that really hurts us, we don't have to disassociate and build up a wall and that's it, never talking to her again. We can, that's our choice. But in fact, have that conversation We were good friends. And I'm really feeling hurt. That's called an affective statement because of XYZ. Communicating that affective statement can actually do a lot toward making me feel better. It may or may not change the relationship, but it's also another way to look after ourselves.
That's I feel like there's just so many examples that came through my mind of, how you can see that. And if, we're adults and I see how important that is, but I think that is for kids to learn that too, right? So thank you for that, because I think if we can use that in our lives in so many places, like you said, even like the hugging a grandchild to me being somewhere where I might not, want to hug a friend, whatever it might mean. I think, and information, right? Boundaries and emotional, I think that's incredible. So thank you. We have this other question. It said, you did say that a few years ago, the buzzword was bullying. Is there a new buzzword, or a focus in restorative justice, especially maybe in light of whether it's COVID or at-home learning?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that, first of all, educators are big on acronyms. So we hear RJ, we hear RP. Maryland is unique. In some local school systems, we hear restorative approaches, but restorative is a big term. And, people are still trying to clarify what the definitions are, because honestly, they vary very much from school to school and from local school system and between the states, et cetera. But that term really represents that emphasis on relationships and on restoring relationships when they've been harmed. So that repair, those are buzzwords that we're hearing, repairing
Right.
harm.
Right. And, like, I guess there's bullying is on the negative side, then there's healthy relationships on the positive side. Is there anything in addition to bullying that you're seeing kind of, I know trauma, right, is another word that you're seeing people kind of be extra alert
Yeah, I
about,
mean,
or
disproportionality is another term that is a very important part of this. Honestly, in Maryland, the reason why we have this law passed is because Maryland and nationally, it's highly recognized. The data's been talking to us for years that our discipline in schools is disproportionate. It's not just. We know that bias exists. We know it exists in our communities. No surprise, it exists in our schools. So that's another very big topic today, as well it should be. Social justice and equity and disproportionality. In Maryland, I would say, and even in our community systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, in each of the different graduate schools, we have somebody who is in charge of disproportionality. We're really trying hard to stamp out the bias that exists. This has been grooming for hundreds of years. It's tough work. It's linked to restorative approaches. The data is still emerging about whether this work actually changes disproportionate data for discipline, but we do know that it improves school climate, and when there's a better school climate, there are better results for all of our students.
Great. And how, if my kid's in a school, how can I find out if they use restorative practices?
Well, I'm always advising schools, they need to put it out there. Parents need to be aware of it. It should be on their websites. There should be announcements. And hopefully you're hearing from your student as they are in school about circles that they're doing today, about restorative questions. I have seen even in elementary schools, little kids in the back of a room, sitting at a table. The teacher says, you two look like you're having an issue. Why don't you go to the circle table at the back? And they're passing a little rock back and forth. What happened? Here's what happened for me, what happened for you. So you should be hearing some of that. It is emerging. Not all schools in Maryland are yet on board, but they're all under this onus of needing to do it. And the Maryland State Department of Education is charged with supporting it.
And so if I was someone who wanted to see it in my school, what would I then do if you're not hearing about it? Any recommendations?
Yes, I would reach out to the administrator or to counseling staff. Very often this is flowing through counselors because they really understand that link to social emotional learning, which they're all about, and ask them to what degree they've started implementing restorative practices. And certainly you, Marissa, you could say, I've learned a lot about it. I can share some materials, et cetera. and offer to support.
Right.
Parents
right.
can be a
And
huge
we're here to
support.
help with that. Yeah. If there's any questions on that, for sure. That's a great point. So thank you so much. This has been incredible. Do we have any other questions? We're going to give it a second. Or Barbara, is there anything you want to add? I know we covered so many topics and points and things about, your incredible work. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. I'm just looking at the chat now, and I see that we've captured those couple of questions. No, I would just say that the issue that we're focused on in the Levitas work is one that has harmed people for years and festered. And, it's tragic that sometimes people who have been harmed are ashamed when they didn't do anything wrong. And so I think talking about that more in our communities is really something that we need to keep doing. And clearly I'm preaching to the choir here. Levitas recognizes that. But, for anybody listening, I think creating opportunities for people to talk about it, more resources in our communities. During this time when we're all watching all sorts of TV on Netflix, I was watching a series, and the next thing I know, I see a group of people sitting and they've all been sexually assaulted and they're in a circle, facilitated by an expert, which gives me hope. We need more of that. We need to support people, and we need to be focused on prevention.
No, thank you. I know, I think we're really excited about with the work that, you've truly helped inform and make possible is, we're also working on a teacher training and a parent training, because like you said, it goes beyond the classroom. And so there's so much for all of us to learn. Like you said, you kind of gave those, takeaways as a person in a community with kids, or just, how you handle kind of conflict with an individual, right? Not solving the problem right away, but instead working on it together and giving someone a chance to speak. Is just, building empathy, all of that is so important. So we're so thankful and really excited to see this change. So, those lower level things that happen, they're going to happen. But the fact that we get to help work on preventing those later, more violent crimes from happening can really just, it'll change not just the person who would have become a survivor's world, but as we've learned from you with the school to prison pipeline, and, it can change the other individual's world too.
Yeah, and I just want to comment that I'm really thrilled as we're branching out into teacher training and parent training. I've done parent training in Baltimore City in a number of different schools, series in circles, building connections with your children. It was called Keep the Connections, and Molly Koch created this amazing work. And as you mentioned, sometimes parents bring attitudes into their homes that are not healthy, and children replicate those. So it's really exciting to be building that curriculum and to develop something that can be broadly available for everybody, crossing all sorts of boundaries, social, emotional. We have wealthy families. We have families in all parts of our state that turn our heads when they might see something that shouldn't be, in terms of boundaries, in terms of gender norms. That's a big one, gender norms. And, you hear about teens being put out because they don't conform, and the trajectory, helping them change their actions so we can change attitudes of the next generation. And that goes for teachers too. Sometimes teachers grow up with certain norms about what's acceptable and what we don't talk about. We don't talk about those things. I'm not a counselor. I'm a teacher. I'm a high school or secondary teacher. And as they understand the importance of empathy and have opportunities to build relationships, they can learn that they too can have an impact simply by being a safe set of ears and helping that student connect with a counselor. And I tell teachers that every day. When you get into that gray zone and you're out of your league, you've got a relationship. Use that relationship to help the individual get support.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And again, thank you to Diane and crew of Taylor Properties for helping to make this webinar happen today, and Barbara for your incredible time and work in the community. We're so excited to, get to do this with you, and we can't wait to see more happen.
It's a privilege. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.